Picture the Sunshine Coast. Blue water, hinterland green, the kind of place people put on vision boards. Now picture a family living in a modest tiny home on a rural block, not bothering anyone. And picture a council enforcement officer showing up with a legal notice. 4 households displaced, 2 dwellings ordered decommissioned, 1 appeal still grinding through a state tribunal in 2026. This is not a statewide ban. It is 1 council, 1 postcode, and a crackdown that raises a very uncomfortable question about who really decides where you're allowed to live. Here is what makes this case worth paying attention to. Queensland has no single law that bans tiny homes outright. The state recognises different use categories, different approval pathways, and different definitions depending on how a dwelling is classified. And yet, within that same state, a single council can mobilise local laws, enforcement notices, and planning codes to make permanent tiny home living practically impossible on a specific rural property. Locals who watched this unfold in Belli Park will tell you they were not watching a bureaucratic accident. They were watching a system operate exactly as it was designed to. The case moved from eviction to decommission order to tribunal appeal across roughly 18 months, and it is still not resolved. That is the anatomy of a crackdown. And it starts here. It is June 2026, and the eviction that started this whole chain of events is already 3 years old, but its consequences are still being counted. On the 12th of June 2023, the ABC reported that Sunshine Coast Council had moved to evict residents from 4 tiny homes on a rural property at Belli Park. 4 households. 4 separate living situations in a landscape of rolling hinterland paddocks where the nearest rental market was, by any honest measure, one of the tightest in Queensland's recent memory. The timing was not incidental. The Australian rental vacancy rate in mid-2023 was running below 1% across multiple regional Queensland markets, a housing emergency in everything but official declaration. What makes the Belli Park evictions land so hard is not just the displacement itself, but the population it hit. These were not speculative investors. Council's own enforcement action, triggered by complaints, targeted residents that community advocates described as vulnerable, people who had found an unconventional but functional housing solution on a rural block, and were using it precisely because the conventional rental market had no room for them. They were not gaming a system, they were surviving one that had already failed them. Think about what that looks like on the ground. You're in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, a landscape that does not feel like a city at all. Open paddocks, spotted gums, afternoon light that turns everything amber. You have a small, fixed home on wheels or a modest temporary dwelling. You're connected to a community. And then a council enforcement officer arrives, acting on complaints, and the notice makes clear that your arrangement does not comply with the local planning rules. You have to leave. And the rental market you're being sent back into has statistically almost nothing to offer. Sunshine Coast Council's position, from the beginning, was that it was responding to complaints and applying its existing local laws. That framing is important. The council did not announce a new policy targeting tiny homes. It acted, it said, on specific complaints about a specific property. But the effect of that action was to push 4 households into a rental market that could not absorb them, at exactly the moment Queensland's housing stress was peaking. That gap between the letter of a council's legal authority and the human consequence of exercising it is the core tension in everything that follows, because the Belli Park eviction was not the end of the council's action. It was the opening move, and the next move was considerably harder. Most people, when they think about an eviction, assume the story ends there. The residents leave, the property sits empty, the file closes. Sunshine Coast Council had a different idea. On the 17th of October 2024, more than a year after the original eviction news broke, the council issued a formal enforcement notice. Not a reminder, not a warning letter, a legal enforcement notice ordering the decommissioning of 2 temporary dwellings on the Belli Park property. The language matters here. Decommissioning is not the same as vacating. Vacating means the people leave. Decommissioning means the dwellings themselves are taken out of use, permanently. That is a meaningful escalation. The 2023 action displaced residents. The 2024 notice targeted the structures. If you comply with a decommission order, you're not just moving out. You're dismantling the thing you built or bought or towed onto your land and set up as a home. The council's enforcement mechanism had moved from policing occupancy to policing the physical existence of the dwellings on the land. For anyone who has ever thought about the tiny home model as a way of sidestepping the prohibitive cost of conventional housing in coastal Queensland, where median dwelling prices in the Sunshine Coast region have consistently tracked well above the Queensland state median, this is the detail that stops you cold. The enforcement notice is the moment where a local government's planning powers translate into something concrete and irreversible. Not a fine, not a compliance schedule, but an order to unmake your home. Consider what the landowner was now facing. The property had already been through the eviction process. Now, 14 months later, there was a formal notice requiring the active dismantling of structures. Refusing to comply with a council enforcement notice in Queensland carries its own escalating legal consequences. Complying means permanent destruction of the dwellings. The landowner was being squeezed from both sides of a legal vice, with no obvious exit that preserved the original intent of the property. Residents and communities around the Sunshine Coast hinterland, who followed this case closely, noted something that does not appear in the formal council documents: the contrast between the council's posture toward tourism infrastructure on the Sunshine Coast, which proceeds with considerable planning flexibility and community facilitation, and the posture toward a handful of modest temporary dwellings on a rural block used by people who simply needed somewhere to live. That contrast is not proof of deliberate targeting, but it is the kind of thing that stays with you. And the landowner's response to the decommission notice is what turned a local enforcement dispute into something with genuinely broader implications. Because they did not comply, they appealed, and that appeal is where the case moved to a completely different arena. Checkpoint. The case had already moved from eviction to enforcement notice, but in 2024 it crossed into a different jurisdiction entirely, a state-level tribunal where the question was no longer just whether the residents had to leave, but whether the council had the legal authority to order the dwellings dismantled. One landowner, one rural property, one appeal that is still active in 2026. Here is something that does not happen every time a council puts an enforcement notice on a rural property. The recipient takes it to a state tribunal. In 2024, the Belli Park landowner lodged a formal appeal against the council's decommission enforcement notice with the Queensland Development Tribunal. That appeal transformed the case from a local planning dispute, the kind that councils manage quietly, compliance is achieved, and nothing much is documented publicly, into a formal legal proceeding with a paper trail, a hearing record, and implications that extend well beyond one paddock in the Sunshine Coast hinterland. The Queensland Development Tribunal exists to hear appeals against council decisions on planning and development matters. It is not a minor venue. Taking a case there means engaging with the full architecture of Queensland planning law, setting out a legal argument about why the council's enforcement notice was wrong, and asking an independent decision-maker to overturn or modify the council's position. It is expensive, time-consuming, and procedurally demanding, which means the landowner made a deliberate choice to fight, not to fold. By 2026, the appeal is still not resolved. That timeline, eviction in June 2023, decommission notice in October 2024, tribunal appeal filed and still running into 2026, is itself a data point worth sitting with. We are talking about roughly 2.5 years of legal proceedings over 4 tiny homes on a rural block. The human cost of that duration, in legal fees, in uncertainty, in the ongoing impossibility of using the property for its intended purpose, is not captured in any council document. What the tribunal appeal actually does, regardless of its eventual outcome, is expose the mechanism. When a landowner challenges a council enforcement notice at the Queensland Development Tribunal, the proceedings require the council to articulate and defend the legal basis for its actions. The classification of the dwellings, the specific local laws invoked, the planning scheme provisions cited, all of it has to be set out and tested. That is exactly what turns a local case into a useful anatomy of how a council's regulatory toolkit actually operates. Ask anyone who has worked with planning law in Queensland and they will tell you the same thing. The difference between a tiny home that is tolerated and one that triggers an enforcement notice often comes down not to the dwelling itself, but to how the council chooses to classify it. The Belli Park appeal is, at its core, a fight over classification, and classification, it turns out, is where all the power lives. Which brings the case to the single legal concept that explains everything that has happened on this property. The tribunal appeal is still pending, the landowner is still fighting, The council's decommission order is still being contested, and in the background of all of it, the Sunshine Coast rental market continues to offer very little to the people who were evicted from those 4 tiny homes 3 years ago. The case is not closed. It is still open, and the legal logic underneath it, the classification framework that made the eviction and the enforcement notice possible in the first place, is what the next part of this case exposes with complete precision. Checkpoint. Everything so far, the eviction, the enforcement notice, the tribunal, rests on a single classification decision that the council makes before any of those mechanisms activate. Get the classification wrong, and none of the enforcement holds. Get it right from the council's perspective, and a home on wheels becomes something the local laws can reach. The entire crackdown is built on one word, one classification. That is where the legal authority to evict, to issue enforcement notices, and to pursue a tribunal case actually originates. Under Queensland's planning and local law framework, a tiny home on wheels that is not connected to main services, water, sewerage, electricity grid, can be classified as a caravan. Not a dwelling, not a building, a caravan. And that single classification decision is what opens the door to a completely different regulatory regime. Sunshine Coast Council, like all Queensland councils, maintains its own local laws governing temporary occupation and caravan use on private land. Those local laws carry restrictions on how long a caravan can be occupied, under what conditions and with what level of council approval. This is the hinge point of the entire Belli Park case, and it is worth being precise about what it means. A tiny home on wheels, a structure that many of its owners experience as a permanent, functional, complete home, can be treated, in law, as a caravan the moment a council decides to apply that classification. That decision does not require a new law. It does not require a state parliament vote. It requires a council officer, a complaint, and the existing text of a local law that was almost certainly written before the tiny home movement existed in its current form. I know that sounds like a technicality. It is not. It is the entire mechanism. When Sunshine Coast Council moved against the Belli Park tiny homes in 2023 and 2024, it was not invoking a law aimed at tiny homes. It was applying existing caravan and temporary dwelling classifications to structures that their occupants were using as permanent homes. The legal authority was always there. The question was whether the council would exercise it. And in Belli Park it did. The implications of this for anyone thinking about a tiny home on the Sunshine Coast, or anywhere in Queensland, are substantial. Queensland does not have a statewide tiny home law that settles the question universally. What it has is a planning framework in which each council's local laws, planning scheme, and enforcement culture determine what is tolerated and what is targeted. 2 properties, 10 kilometres apart, in 2 different council areas, could face completely different legal realities for an identical tiny home on an identical block. That is municipal fragmentation in its purest form, and it is the feature of the system, not a bug, but a structural characteristic, that the Sunshine Coast case makes visible. The council did not need to pass a new regulation. It had everything it needed in laws that were already on the books. All it needed was a complaint, a decision to act, and a classification. For tiny home advocates in Queensland, this is the most unsettling part of the Belli Park case. More unsettling in some ways than the eviction itself. An eviction is visible, documented, and contestable. A classification is quiet. It happens before the enforcement notice, before the tribunal appeal, before any of the machinery of planning law starts moving. It is the invisible first step that makes all the visible steps possible. And what the Sunshine Coast case has done, by becoming public and by reaching a state tribunal, is make that first step visible for the first time. But none of the above captures the full picture of why tiny home permanence is so legally precarious in the Sunshine Coast Council area. The caravan classification covers one scenario, a dwelling on wheels, unconnected to services. The moment that scenario changes, a completely different set of requirements activates. Here is the situation that the Sunshine Coast planning framework creates for anyone who wants to live permanently in a tiny home within the council area. If you use a tiny home as a permanent dwelling, not a weekend retreat, not a temporary camp, but a year-round, full-time home, you can trigger up to 3 separate approval categories simultaneously. Planning approval under the local planning scheme, building approval under the Building Act, plumbing and drainage approval under the Plumbing and Drainage Act. 3 separate regimes, 3 separate assessment processes, 3 separate opportunities for non-compliance. It looks like a mistake when you first read it. It doesn't feel like it should be real, but it is. A tiny home used full-time can require all 3 approvals before it is legal as a permanent dwelling in the Sunshine Coast Council area, and the absence of even one of those approvals leaves the occupant exposed to exactly the kind of enforcement action that played out at Belli Park. This is not speculation. This is the compliance wall that sits behind the crackdown. The planning approval piece is the most complex. To obtain planning approval for a tiny home as a permanent dwelling, the use must be consistent with the land's zoning under the Sunshine Coast planning scheme. Rural hinterland zones, which is where Belli Park sits, often have specific provisions about what constitutes an approved residential use and what supporting infrastructure is required. A tiny home that cannot demonstrate compliance with those provisions does not get approved, and operating without approval is what makes enforcement action legally possible. Building approval adds a second layer. A structure used as a permanent dwelling is assessed against the National Construction Code, which includes requirements for structural integrity, weatherproofing, fire safety, and habitability standards. A tiny home built to THOW standards, tiny home on wheels standards, may or may not satisfy those requirements depending on its design and construction. The fact that it is mobile does not exempt it from assessment if it is being used as a permanent dwelling. And then there is plumbing and drainage approval. A permanent dwelling needs to deal with water supply and waste management in ways that comply with Queensland's plumbing laws. Off-grid systems, rainwater tanks, composting toilets, grey water management are not automatically compliant just because they function. They need to be assessed and approved under the relevant framework. Every one of these approval requirements has a cost, a timeline, and an assessment process. Taken together, they create a compliance pathway that many tiny homeowners simply cannot afford to navigate, financially, legally, or practically. Here is the dynamic that locals who have watched the Sunshine Coast housing market closely will recognise. The approval pathway for a permanent tiny home is, in theory, open. The council has not banned permanent tiny homes by name, but the combination of planning scheme requirements, building assessment, and plumbing approval, each with its own costs and technical demands, creates a compliance wall that effectively excludes the people most likely to need tiny homes as a housing solution. The people who cannot afford conventional housing are also, by definition, the people least likely to be able to afford the professional help needed to navigate 3 simultaneous approval processes. There is one detail in the approval framework that crystallizes the whole paradox, and it is worth stating plainly. The line between a caravan and a building requiring full planning and building approval is, under the Sunshine Coast framework, largely a question of use. Use the structure temporarily, move it regularly, don't connect to services, don't make it your permanent home, and the caravan classification may apply. Use it permanently, live in it full time, the way you would a house, and the building approval requirements may activate. Living in it the way a home is meant to be lived in is exactly what flips the legal status and triggers the compliance requirements. Full-time occupation is not a neutral fact, it is a legal trigger. That is the architecture of the crackdown. Not a new law, not a state ban, not even a formal policy targeting tiny homes. Just an existing set of classifications, local laws and approval requirements applied by one council in response to specific complaints on a specific property that has produced 2.5 years of eviction proceedings, enforcement notices and tribunal appeals, with no resolution in sight as of 2026. One council, one property, one anatomy of exactly how a legal framework that was never designed specifically to exclude tiny homes can still do exactly that. Several council area regulations, one property in the hinterland, and a case still grinding through a tribunal 3 years after the first eviction notice. The machinery was never labelled anti-tiny home. It did not need to be. The question the Sunshine Coast case leaves open is not whether councils have the legal authority to act the way this one did. They clearly do. The question is whether a framework built on local classifications, caravan laws, and triple approval pathways can ever create the kind of housing flexibility that the rental crisis has been demanding. That question does not have an answer yet. Which of the 3 approval hurdles, planning, building, or plumbing, do you think is the hardest for a tiny homeowner to realistically clear? Write it in the comments. And if you want to keep tracking how planning rules shape the places people can and cannot call home, subscribe. This case